Everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of OPG Live. Typically, I start off by saying welcome to this exciting episode of OPG Live, but I feel like I'm always setting up expectations, so we're going to just go low and say the latest episode, and then you can judge at the end whether you find it exciting or not. I'm your host, professional photographer Ian Plant.
And I'm Leah Zahner. I'll be keeping an eye on all the questions as they come in and delivering them to Ian.
Why, thank you. I would hope that you're going to try to do something other than just question delivery.
Well, I thought we were setting the bar
low. Okay.
So we can exceed expectations.
That's a very good point. Wow, we've got a really episode available for you today.
We do.
Yes.
I actually do have an announcement to get started.
We have some very unexciting announcements to get started.
It might be quite exciting. We'll have to see. It is a wildlife photography contest that you can enter or vote in, or both. So you can enter that wildlife photo contest to win an incredible prize package. And the photography equipment and software prizes include a Fujifilm X-T30 camera, Skylum Luminar 3 and 4 bundle, and a $250 gift card from mpb.com. So that is a total value of $1,700, which is an awesome prize package. You get to show off your amazing wildlife photography and encourage your friends to vote by clicking the banner underneath the video or the link in the description. So you can enter your photo, vote for your favorites, participate in that wildlife photography competition and contest, and get involved.
Well, that sounds, I'm going to use the word, that sounds exciting.
I thought it might be.
Well, very good. So I guess the announcements are out of the way. Have you mentioned that we're sponsored by
Tamron?
Thank you. Sponsored by Tamron. I was recently on a photo adventure using Tamron's 15 to 30 millimeter lens in the Canadian Rockies. Before that, I was in the Badlands of South Dakota, Badlands National Park, and I've got a few photo adventures to share with you today. And of course, as always, we will be taking viewer questions. So if you have any questions, please send them in to us, and we'll do our best to answer as many viewer questions during the hour, and we'll get to as many as we can. But as always, the funniest ones are more likely to be read out loud. So try to spice things up a little bit so we can make this episode exciting.
That's right.
But why don't we dive into some of my photos? So I spent a week in the Badlands, and Badlands National Park is just one of my favorite places to make photographs. I think someone actually asked me the question recently, what is your favorite national park to photograph in? And I often get this question from people. People often ask me, where's your favorite place in the world to go photograph? And I always have a tough time answering that question because there's so many beautiful places around the world, and every place has its own unique beauty. But when I get the narrower question, what's your favorite national park in the U.S. to photograph? Badlands National Park is my automatic answer. I just absolutely love this place. It's so much fun for me personally to go photograph there. And I like it because there's not a lot of stand-up photo icons. There's no famous spots. You know, like you go to some national parks like Yellowstone National Park or Yosemite or Arches National Park, and you'll show up at some locations and there might be 300 or 400 photographers there waiting for that sunset light for that one particular spot. And you're like fighting with people, jabbing elbows, you know, tripod legs are tripping people and stuff like that. And it's crazy. I cannot stand it. But in Badlands National Park, I can just lose myself in the wilderness there. And there are all these interesting eroded badlands, hence the name, with lots of great colors, lots of great formations. So I can go in there and I can find really unique and interesting compositions. And I love that I'm photographing in areas that I know no one ever goes to. I've never, ever seen another photographer in a lot of the spots in the Badlands that I go to. I've never even seen so much as a tripod hole, except for my own tripod holes. And they usually get washed away quite frequently because the landscape gets refreshed every time it rains there. And the landscape is characterized by a lot of mud. It's made of this bentonite clay. When it rains, all that turns into mud. You do not want to walk around the Badlands after a heavy rainfall. But then as the rain dries, the mud it begins to dry, it bakes in the heat, and it cracks. And you get all these interesting patterns and formations as a result. And the erosion patterns there are the basis of some of my favorite compositions. So I'm going to dive in and show you some of these photos. I was leading one of my masterclass photo workshops there. And so I wasn't doing much of my own photography. I was working with clients. But I got a few free moments where I could take a quick picture. And I'll just show you a few of the shots that I got. So diving into the iPad where the photos are, and I'm holding the pen of destiny. So this is actually one of my favorite compositions from the Badlands. What I do as a landscape photographer is I spend a lot of time scouting and exploring, looking for good compositions, not just looking for good scenic areas, but looking for foreground formations that work together well with a nice scenic background. When you find those visual elements that work really well together, then it's just a matter of going back to that exact same spot several different times, waiting to get the perfect light to bring it all together. So for this particular shot, this is a composition that I've been sitting on for maybe about a year and a half, but I've never actually been to this spot and gotten the sunrise that I wanted. So this morning when I took the shot was the best sunrise light I've gotten there. And so what's going on in this shot is it's actually the pre-dawn twilight glow. So the clouds that were above where the sun was rising were lighting up with a lot of color, and those clouds were to the east, and there's not any interesting formations that way. So I turned my back on that really pretty sunrise that was going on because all of that red light was bouncing down onto the landscape below to the west. And so I've got this really nice colorful glow on the sandstone formations here in the shot. And then you've got some clouds in the sky in the background that add some visual interest to that part of the composition. A lot of times when I go to this particular spot, it's just sunny out and there's nothing interesting going on in the sky. So I was lucky to have some color and some shapes in the sky. But what I really like about this particular shot, I'm going to go into edit, and then I'm going to go ahead and mark this up a little bit. The reason why I'm interested with this particular composition is because of the shape of the foreground. Well, let's see if I can do a different color there. Sorry, let me start over. So the shape of the foreground here, there's this kind of V shape or a U shape that's formed by the erosion that is carving out the landscape here. Anytime it rains, more and more of the sediment gets washed away. You get all these shapes that emerge. So that V, that U shape that leads the eye deeper into the background, and then you've got the gully itself, which kind of wends its way around, eventually pointing to this really nice formation in the background. This is a composition that when I first spotted it about a year or two ago, I knew that it was something interesting, and it was just a matter of keeping going back, being persistent, waiting for the right light, which is what I got here. So I'm pretty happy with the way that turned out, and let's just go ahead and go back to the photos so I can show you the next in the list. One other evening I was out there hiking around in one of my favorite spots. There was this wicked thunderstorm. And so I really like the compositional opportunities in the Badlands, all these erosion patterns and lines and a lot of the different colors. There's a lot of volcanic ash, I think, that's mixed in to the sandstone here. So you've got a lot of interesting red, green, yellow, orange, and blue pastel colors that you can find in the sediment. But the other thing that I really love about this is what's going on in the sky. The Badlands have notoriously fickle weather, especially when it's warmer during the summer months. You get lots of really big storm clouds that build up over the Great Plains. This is a very famous place for storm chasing. People love going through the Great Plains looking for big thunderstorms in the summer. And so the Badlands are within this Great Plains ecosystem, so you get some really wicked thunderstorms that build up. And even though this shot was taken in September and things are beginning to cool down, there still is a lot of thunderstorm activity. As a matter of fact, there's thunderstorms ripping through there this week, even though things have kind of cooled down quite a bit. So it's really great when you get these storms building up. Now, if they build up and they happen to head your way, you could get rained on pretty bad. But more often than not, when I see these storms building up, they're in the distance and they just make the sky look incredible at sunset. So I love going out into the Badlands at sunset, love hiking out into the wilderness and finding these unique areas that no one else is photographing. And then to have one of those big summer thunderstorms rolling in the background is the icing on the cake. So the challenge is finding a composition that's going to work with that stunning background. And so I spent a lot of time scouting lots of different compositions for any particular area. I might have an A option, a B option, a C, and a D option. And then I picked the one that's going to work best where the color and the clouds are. So obviously the sky is different every time you go out there. Sometimes you might get a lot of color in the sky in a particular area, so you have to find a composition that'll work with that color. So having a lot of different options is always a really good strategy. So you know ahead of time what are the best compositions, and then you can just pick the one that's working best with the light. So in this next photo, this is another one of my secret spots. This is a composition that I have literally been sitting on for 1 or 2 years, and I keep going back to this spot, and I've been waiting for the perfect light to really bring this together, and I've never quite gotten it. I've gotten some different conditions, and I've tried this composition a lot of times, and during the workshop, actually got pretty lucky. We had a really nice sunrise. There was some good color in the clouds in the sky. So as the sun was rising, it was lighting up the clouds with this rosy pink color, which was really nice. Now the cloud shapes, I think, work okay with this particular composition, but it's not really what I was looking for completely. So this is maybe an A or a B+ effort for this particular composition, but I'm still looking for that home run, that A+ shot. So you can bet I'm going to go back to this composition again, keep working on it until I finally get the clouds that I really like. But what I love about this particular composition, the reason I keep going back, is because of the leading lines in the foreground. The erosion patterns in this particular spot are really dramatic, and those lines are leading to this really nice background mound that's got a lot of color. It's got a lot of different textures that are repeated. The shape keeps repeating over and over again. And I just love this background. I spent a lot of time in the Badlands looking for really interesting backgrounds, and then once I found the background that I like, then I hunt for the foreground to bring it all together. Now, one morning, I told my workshop clients that getting up for sunrise was optional. We had stayed out late the night before doing some star photography. So I told everyone, I'll be ready to go early in the morning for sunrise, and anyone who doesn't want to sleep in can go out with me. Well, lucky for me, no one showed up in the morning, so I got a free pass to go do what I want. So I decided to go out to a favorite spot of mine that's actually outside of the national park. It's on public land. It's got the Badland formations, but because it's outside the national park, I can fly my drone there. So it's a legal place for me to fly my drone. It's illegal to fly the drone in the national park, though. That doesn't stop a lot of people. One of the mornings I was there with my group, I heard the familiar buzz of a drone passing overhead. So there's a lot of people flying illegally in the park. I personally will never do that. So I found places where I can fly my drone outside the park that are perfectly legal. And so I had a little bit of fun working with this particular spot. I really like the aerial perspective you can get on these formations because you can really see all the folds that are created by the erosion. And so all of these little erosion lines that I'm using as my foregrounds for my land-based wide-angle compositions get writ large upon the landscape when you get a higher aerial perspective. So the same sort of pattern just gets bigger and bigger the higher up you go. So there's a lot of different compositional opportunities for land-based and aerial photography over formations like this. So I had some nice sunrise glow on these cliffs. There was a few clouds in the background that were lighting up. And I managed to find a good composition that allowed me, even though I was flying the drone above the formation, I was still using the erosion patterns in the cliffs at the bottom of the image as a foreground, leading the eye deeper into the composition. And so I'm always thinking about this near-far juxtaposition, whether I'm really close to something near or whether I'm far away from something that is going to be the near element in my photograph. So even though my drone was several hundred feet above the nearest elements, in this particular composition, I was still thinking about the juxtaposition of near visual elements versus far visual elements to make the composition more interesting, to give it the illusion of depth, and to help lead the viewer's eye deeper into the composition through a visual progression of shapes. Here's another shot I made in this area with my drone. This is looking straight down at some of the erosion patterns. So I was several hundred feet above this particular pattern. So these canyons are actually pretty big, pretty deep. You know, the canyon I was flying over here that you see in the erosion pattern, probably about 70 or 80 feet deep. So these patterns are really striking. And as I said, the higher you go, it doesn't really change the way these patterns look. They look very similar to someone who's floating 2 feet above the ground as they might look for someone who's 2 miles above the ground. It's just the scale your distance from everything changes, but all of these erosion lines just get repeated and they just get bigger and bigger as you take a broader view. So it's really amazing just the way this whole landscape kind of fits together. And then here's a final shot that I took with my drone that morning, that one morning of freedom during my workshop, which was really nice. And you can see the cliffs at the bottom of the image frame. Those are lit up by the rising sun, so there's some warm, colorful, reddish light on them. And then the rest of the formations are at the top of this plateau, and they're deeper. They don't face the rising sun, so they're in the shadow. And as a result, the light that is illuminating them is primarily light reflecting from the blue sky above. So there's a really nice, warm, cool color contrast here that I used for this particular photo to make the composition more interesting. Okay, well, that's the end of my Badlands photos. Do we have any questions that have come in?
Well, we have, as promised, an exciting question.
Okay, an exciting question. I could tell you had your question face. You looked like there was a question that had come in.
I was ready. Shane has the first question that we're going to get to today.
Hello, Shane.
And he says, okay, exciting question. If you're in the Canadian Rockies, being chased by a large grizzly bear, what tips do you have for, 1, getting a crisp shot in while having to adjust to a moving subject, and 2, maybe more importantly, maybe less, I'm not sure, not die?
Okay, well, so just remember, you can choose one. You can either get a good shot or you can not die. You can't do both. So the first thing is don't let a bear chase you. If you see a bear, do not run, because that will trigger the hunting instinct, and the bear will more than likely than not come after you. So stand your ground, make sure you make a lot of noise, you can clap. Basically, you want to make the bear aware of your presence. Bears don't really like people. They tend to back away when they realize someone's there, but they might not always know that you're there because they have really bad eyesight. And so it's easy to startle a bear. Yeah, I mean, they all need glasses, basically. It'd be sad, except they don't really know the difference. So it's really easy to startle a bear. So when I'm hiking in the Canadian Rockies, I am making a lot of noise. I'm talking a lot, just like I'm doing during this episode. So it comes naturally to me to talk a lot. And, I talk to the bears that may or may not be lying in ambush waiting to eat me. So that's lesson number 1. So if you're not running from the bear, it's much easier to get a shot that is nice and sharp because you're not busy jogging, you're standing still instead. And as a matter of fact, you can incorporate your camera into your display when you're trying to make the bear aware of your presence and make the bear think that you're more of a threat than you really are. You can wave your camera around in front of it so that it thinks you're bigger than you really are. Maybe it'll think you're like a big giant bear and it'll be scared away. But yeah, definitely don't run from a bear. The best thing you can do is bring a tastier, slower friend with you and let him or her run from the bear. That's my absolute best advice for that situation.
I like that one to start us off. That was a good question.
Yes. If you're with a party of hikers in bear country and you don't know who the bear bait is, it's you.
Ooh.
Yeah, they've already picked you.
You don't want to have that feeling.
Yeah.
Well, with the questions kicked off, I'm going to keep an eye on them as they continue to come on in. So please keep adding all of your questions. We'll get to as many as possible. I'm going to pull us back to the very top of our chat here. Okay. We have a question from Lively One Lori.
All right.
Yes.
Hello, Lori.
I recently, 3 years ago, found a passion I never knew existed. I post my photos often on social media, and the response is crazy sometimes. What is your best advice for a beginner like myself? What got you interested in photography?
The story of my interest in photography is long and convoluted. How much time do we have left?
Not long and convoluted time.
Okay, I'll try to give you the short summary. I picked up my first camera maybe 25 years ago. I was in law school at the time. And I worked a summer job at a big firm in New York City. First time in my life I'd ever made any real money, so I bought a camera. And I realized pretty quickly that I had just made a huge $100,000 mistake. Not on the camera, on my law school education. So I was hooked on photography right away. I had to work for quite some time to pay off that big law school expense that I had. But after 8 years of working for the man, I was free to become a photographer. So I quit my job and I became a professional photographer. That was about 15 years ago, and I've never looked back. So for me, it just very quickly became a hobby, transformed into a passion, became a career, and now it's a lifestyle. It's a way of life. I can't imagine life without my camera. So that's how I got into photography. I'm not exactly sure what it was that triggered it, but it just all fell into place when I started doing it. And social media can be a lot of fun. You can get a thrill when people really like your photo, but I would definitely advise people not to let that replace your own artistic integrity and your own personal artistic vision. I think a lot of times people are chasing likes on social media. You definitely have a lot of really famous Instagram photographers, and a lot of their shots begin to kind of look the same after a while because there's a certain way of doing things that seems to trigger a response from people. So I tell people social media is fun. It's always great if other people like your work, but it's okay if people don't like your work. As a matter of fact, part of being an artist is showing people the world in a way that they're not used to seeing it and challenging their perceptions. And sometimes that means as an artist, you're going to see something that other people don't see. And that's okay. It's your job as a photographer to try to translate your personal vision as best you can so that others can enjoy it. But I honestly think that my favorite photos are the ones that are least popular on social media, because I know that they're better representation of my work than the more popular stuff. And they're more true to my personal artistic vision. Or at least that's what I tell myself when I don't get any likes at all for photos that I put up. I just say, you know what? People don't understand it. They're not good enough to get it. So that's my theory.
So you'll never know where it'll take you.
Exactly.
3 years in for you. That's
3 years
really
in.
great.
Yeah. Well, those are the best of the 3 years, but it keeps on getting better.
Yeah.
So.
All right, let's move on to the next question. This one's from Thomas.
Okay. Hello, Thomas.
Thomas is asking, what is the best way to use the sun's rays for the best picture?
Okay, well I often like shooting into the sun and incorporating the sun into my photography. Usually the best way to do that is with a wide-angle lens. And what you want to do is stop down the lens and use a small aperture like f11 or f16, because that'll make that sunburst effect that you get with a wide-angle lens when you're shooting into the sun. It'll make that look stronger. The more you stop down, the stronger it will appear, though most good wide-angle lenses will have a pretty good sunburst effect at f11 or f16. You don't always have to stop down to like f22 because there are problems with that. F20, the smaller the aperture you use, this thing called diffraction kicks in, which is an optical defect that overall kind of reduces image quality. So I tend to avoid using those really tiny apertures as a result. I get a sharper picture at f11 or f16, and the starburst usually looks good enough at that aperture. And I've found that the best thing you can do is to just partially block the sun by something else in the image frame. It could be a mountain in the background, it could be a cloud that's passing, it could be a tree trunk. You want to include enough of the sun peeking out around that object so you get that starburst effect. But what you're trying to do by partially blocking it is mitigating lens flare. So if you're shooting directly into the sun, you're going to get a lot of lens flare, which is light striking the front element of the glass. And glass, no matter how well it's manufactured, is imperfect. Any imperfection is going to create these little blobs of flare. They look like these little green spaceships in your image. And that can reduce image quality. Sometimes you can use that stuff creatively, but a lot of times it's just going to be unsightly. You're trying to avoid it. So by partially blocking the sun, you can mitigate or reduce the amount of flare that's in your image, but still get that really nice starburst effect.
All right, sounds pretty helpful.
Okay, well, I'm going to dive back into my photos. I've got 2 more photos to show. This time I went up, when I went to the Canadian Rockies, I was done with the Badlands, I drove home. Next day, hopped on a flight, went up to Calgary. I joined my good friend Zach Mills, and we spent a week photographing in the Canadian Rockies. He actually lives up there with his family. And basically, we had some really bad luck, which is not atypical. Every time I go up there, I have really bad weather luck. I've been up there maybe a sum total of 5 weeks doing photography over the past few years, and I have never gotten really stunning light. I almost always get maybe 1 or 2 moments that are kind of okay, but don't really come together the way that I wanted to. And the weather started off pretty decent in the beginning and quickly deteriorated by the end of the week. It was snowing. There was maybe like a half a foot of snow that came down as I was driving away from the mountains to go to Calgary. And I'm thinking, yeah, this is pretty much the way it always goes for me. So I did get 2 photos that are okay, that I'm kind of happy with. Not great, but they're okay. So I'm gonna show you those photos. Now, I didn't have to fight any grizzly bears to make these photos. I didn't see a single bear the whole time I was there. As a matter of fact, I've never seen a single grizzly bear in the 5 weeks total of photography that I've spent in the Canadian Rockies. So bear encounters are actually pretty rare, but now if you do encounter a bear up there, you know exactly what to do. So remember, slower, tastier friend, and wear a pair of running sneakers so you can outrun your friend.
Shane did comment, bringing my brother to be the bear bait for an exciting shot.
Exactly. And and if the bear doesn't get the message, you can always slip like a salmon into your brother's pocket, and then there's no doubt that the bear is going to go for him. But let's dive in, and there are a few Canadian Rocky shots that turned out okay. So this is a spot that I've been to a few times. Once again, I look for interesting compositions, and then I keep hitting these same spots over and over again until I get some good light. And this particular composition is something I developed a few years back. I've been to this spot a few times. I got kind of lucky this morning. The clouds really lit up nice. I zoomed out wide-angle perspective. I was using Tamron's 15 to 30 millimeter wide-angle lens, which, by the way, is a fantastic lens. It's exceptionally sharp. Very happy with it. And by going wide, I was able to incorporate these interesting clouds that were passing over the mountain, catching the pre-dawn light. So they were glowing with this really pink, rosy color. And this was before any of the light was actually striking the mountain. And unfortunately, this particular mountain doesn't really get super direct sunlight at sunrise, so it kind of lights up on the side. So this moment of cloud light was really the best of the sequence that I got. I have some other shots where there's some light on the mountain, but because of the angle it's coming in at this time of year, I wasn't really getting the whole mountain lighting up, which is what I would have preferred. So this shot taken during the cloud light phase, when there's light on the cloud, color on the clouds, but nothing yet on the landscape, turned out to be the best. And I found this pool in this marshy area that had some sand on one side that I used as my foreground, so I got down low so I could reflect the clouds in the sky in the pool of water, and I used the leading shape of the sand as my foreground. So let me go ahead and just kind of show you graphically how that worked. So you can see here there we go. You can see here the shape of the sand helps frame the reflections of the clouds in the water, and also helps lead the viewer's eye deeper into the composition. And then the other shot that I got that I thought was okay was a few mornings after. This is a particular spot that I had scouted out and returned at sunrise, and it looked like it was going to be a stunning sunrise. There was this beautiful cloud that was growing over the mountain, and the cloud was beginning to get a little bit of color, and then the whole thing stopped. So this cloud that was growing above the mountain behind me, where the sun was rising, this other cloud was just growing up out of nowhere, and it was blocking that beautiful sunrise light. So it was a good 15 or 20 minutes before that cloud passed on and the sunlight came through. And by then, that warm, colorful light had left the cloud. There was some warm light on the mountain, which is reflected in the water, and I used the marsh grass on the edge of the pond here to help frame the scene and lead the viewer's eye deeper into the composition. But it's a real shame, because if this had lit up at sunrise where I had that light on the clouds and on the mountain, I think this could have been really stunning. But sometimes, as they say, sometimes you eat the bear, and sometimes the bear eats you. Metaphorically speaking, not really.
They do say that.
Yes.
Sometimes.
So, Canadian Rockies, I've been eaten by the bear more than I care to admit. One of these days I'll go up there and I'll actually have some good weather. But this time it just didn't happen. So those are my photos that I've taken recently in the past month since our last episode. So now we have time for many more user questions.
Yes, and keep them coming as we continue to move through. Just a reminder, you can peek underneath the banner, underneath the video, or the link in the description if you're wanting to participate in that wildlife photography contest. So that $1,700 prize pack is ready and available. Ooh. You can participate in voting. Check it out at any time.
$1,700 prize pack. I might enter.
Ooh, lots of equipment, fun stuff that you can get. We'll move on to a question from Bill to start us off here.
Hello, Bill.
Bill is asking to please explain using a polarizing filter, shooting mode AV/TV manual, and exposure compensation to get the best results.
Okay, so a polarizer filter is designed to remove reflections or glare from your photo. And really the only time that I ever use a polarizer is if I'm photographing a scene like a waterfall or a stream or maybe in a forest, because you get all these wet rocks that are reflecting a lot of glare from the sky above, and you want to get rid of that, and you want to enhance the contrast and color in the scene. So I'll use a polarizer pretty much only in those situations. So I'm not using a polarizer for much of anything else when I'm doing nature photography. And a polarizer will reduce the amount of light coming into your lens by, on average, 2 stops. So if you're shooting in manual mode, you're going to need to compensate by adding more light. So you need to lengthen your shutter speed or reduce your aperture or increase your ISO to bring more light in to compensate for that. Now, if you're in an automatic shooting mode like aperture priority or shutter priority, the camera is going to be automatically calculating and adding more light by doing the opposite of what the priority mode is. So if you're in aperture priority mode, the camera will compensate when you put the polarizer on and automatically increase your shutter speed to keep the exposure value constant. So shooting with a polarizer is actually pretty easy. You just don't really need to use it for that many situations. And one thing you should avoid using a polarizer for is to darken a blue sky in a wide angle shot, because you'll get uneven polarization of the sky. The amount of polarization increases until it maximizes at a 90% angle from the light source. So with a wide angle lens, you might be covering a large portion of the sky. So the left side of your shot might be polarized more than the right side, and that just looks bad. Now, one area where a polarizer filter is a secret weapon is when you're photographing rainbows. Now, a rainbow is not really a reflection, it's a refraction. I don't know the difference. They're both kind of the same thing. A rainbow is like a reflection in the sky. But, you know, as I said, technically it's something called a refraction, but it's pretty much the same thing. And a polarizer, if you spin the polarizer, you will get rid of the rainbow. But as you continue to spin the polarizer past that point, you'll notice that the rainbow seems to get a lot more colorful and look like it's popping out of the scene much more. Now, you're not actually polarizing the rainbow at that point, you're polarizing what's behind the rainbow, but it is a secret weapon. If you use the polarizer, don't remove the rainbow, keep spinning until it looks stronger. And when it looks at its strongest, you'll find that with the polarizer, it'll actually look better than without the polarizer filter. But as I said, don't remove the rainbow. If you are spinning the polarizer and the rainbow goes away, you're on the wrong side. Okay, you got to keep spinning to the opposite side until the rainbow really pops out strongly.
I like that little secret weapon for rainbow shooting. All right, let's move on to Hannah's question next.
Okay, Hannah.
Hannah
Welcome.
is asking, do you have tips for photographing an overlook?
So I guess it depends on the overlook. These are questions that are very general and hard to answer because every specific scene will be different. But when I find myself, now I guess I could interpret this question a few different ways. So maybe you're on a road overlook and you're just showing up and you see, you know, there's this concrete structure that's built on the side of the road so people can look out over the wilderness. It might be a really beautiful scene, but that might not be something that's very photogenic. You could go out and zoom in and just snap a shot of the background scenery, but I'm often talking a lot about using foreground. So if you're sitting there on the concrete structure, there might not be a good foreground. It might just be the concrete structure that you're on. So that kind of overlook I tend to avoid because all you can really do is zoom in and shoot the background scenery. And you know, anyone who shows up there is going to get that same shot. It may not be terribly interesting, and you're not going to create that dynamic near-far composition that I'm often looking for when I'm doing landscape photography. Now, there's a different way of interpreting overlook. Let's say you're hiking on a trail and maybe you get to the top of a mountain or up onto the top of a cliff and there's a natural overlook. Well, there you might actually have some great opportunities to incorporate some of the natural features of that overlook into your composition. You can create that near far wide angle juxtaposition that can be really powerful. So a lot of times when I'm hiking and I get out to some sort of cliff or mountain overlook, I'll use the rocks at the top of the cliff as foreground features juxtaposed against the background in the sky to make a more dynamic composition.
All right.
But probably if it's just like a tourist overlook in a park that's just a road, ignore those areas. They're not going to be that exciting. Instead, get out there, get off the beaten path. You don't even have to go far. You just walk a few hundred feet off the road, and often you can find some really interesting foregrounds to juxtapose against that background scenery. I think most people who go to national parks, the statistic is something like 98% of them never walk more than 100 feet away from the road. So if you're doing photography, you're going to want to walk more than 100 feet away from the road, by and large, just to get something different, unique, and something more powerful. You don't have to go very far. Just go 101 feet, and you're already doing better than 98% of the people who go there.
101 feet. I'm going to remember that the next time I'm traveling. We have another question coming in from Jack.
Mm-hmm. Hello, Jack.
Jack asks, what do you look for in a potential location? How do you scout out a location for compelling photos?
Well, so I usually start off, if I'm shooting landscape, for example, I'll start off by looking for interesting background scenery. And a lot of times that's the easy part. Like you go to some place like Yosemite National Park, the background scenery is pretty obvious. Same thing with the Canadian Rockies. But usually I'm looking for something that's really unique, something that really is going to stand out, because I know that when I go wide with my wide angle lens, that big background is going to shrink down. So I want something that's going to be interesting, and I want something that's still going to be big enough in my composition that it's not going to get lost. So that's my first step. I figure out where I want to be for my background. Once I found my background, I start looking for an interesting foreground. And you saw that in the pictures from the Badlands in particular, also in the Canadian Rockies. I'm looking for some sort of visual feature that's relatively near where I'm standing that is going to help lead the viewer's eye deeper into the scene. So I'm looking for a bold shape. I'm looking for some sort of pattern. I'm looking for some leading lines, something interesting, something that's got a good shape that's going to help encourage the viewer on their visual journey through your composition. So finding a way to bring that background together with a good foreground, and then the icing on the cake is a really great and colorful sky above the background. I'm looking to find a way to bring all of these things together. So I usually spend, on average, I would say 8 hours scouting for every 1 hour of photography. So it's a full-time job. When I'm out in the field, I spend most of my time looking for good shots, good compositions, and once I find them, I go back to those compositions and just wait for the sunrise or sunset light that's going to make it work.
Perfect. Let's move to Joe's question next.
Hello, Joe.
Joe asks, if you could take only one lens with you to any photo op, what would it be?
Wide angle zoom. Absolutely. I love shooting wide angle, and that is true of just about every type of photography I do. It's especially true with my landscape work, and when I do travel work, even with my wildlife work. I prefer, when I can, to shoot wide angle than to shoot with a telephoto lens. It requires a much different approach for my wildlife photography. But yeah, wide angle zoom, the wider the better. I love an ultra wide angle perspective. It's tricky to work with. You really are forced to work hard to find a good background. As I said, it's not going to shrink down too much when you go wide angle, and then to find a really compelling foreground to work with it. But when you make it happen, when you bring this all together, that wide angle perspective can give you a really powerful, unique take on the world. So absolutely, without a doubt, sometimes, in fact, that is the only lens I carry with me. A lot of my photo trips, I just bring a wide angle lens and nothing else.
Perfect. Let's move to George's question.
Hello, Georgia. Now, are you Georgia the name or Georgia the state?
This is George.
Oh, George.
Yes.
Oh.
George P. George's question.
George's question. Sorry, George. I apologize.
That's okay. So George is asking, do you have any tips on creating a better saturated blue sky?
Okay, yes. So instead of using a polarizer filter to darken that blue sky, One easy thing to do is if you're working in something like Adobe Lightroom or most other image editing programs will allow you to select a single color. So you can actually go in and select the blues, and you can darken those blues. And that's going to make them look richer, bolder, and make anything in the sky that's not blue, like white clouds, for example, pop out a lot more. So it allows you to achieve that polarizer effect without risking getting uneven polarization of the sky. So if you're in Adobe Lightroom, you go into the HSL module when you're developing the image, and then you select the blues, and you can just selectively darken the blues. You can even increase the saturation of the blues. I would avoid going too far with saturating the blues. I find that blues tend to look pretty good. When you start pushing the saturation of the blues in the sky, it can begin to look really fake. So I'm often actually pulling back on the saturation just a little bit myself, but that's my personal preference.
All right, let's move to Danny's question.
Hello, Danny.
Danny says, Ian, where do you turn for inspiration? What helps drive your decisions for composition and subject matter?
Well, in terms of inspiration, I just let my subject be my guide. I don't really look much at what other people are doing. I think it's a good thing when you're first learning to look at the work of other people. But the problem with that, it's a good way to learn, but eventually you'll get to the point where you'll see someone else's good shot and you're going to want to get the same shot. And so to avoid doing that, to keep my artistic vision my own, to keep it unique, to keep it sort of pure, is I just don't really look much at the work of others. And I let my subject be my guide, and I let my subject inspire me. So the subject, the light, the moment, these are the things that I'm always chasing. And so this is what I'm always looking for when I'm making photos.
Great answer. Let's go to Brooke's question next. When I turn off autofocus and do manual, my pictures are blurry. So more of a comment than a question, but maybe you have some insights. Well,
if you are turning off the autofocus and you're shooting manual focus instead, and the pictures are blurry, that means you're not properly focusing the images. Autofocus is great for a lot of different types of photography. I'm usually using it when I'm doing travel or wildlife photography. For landscape, I'm focusing manually, but that's because with landscape, you're trying to get your entire scene in focus. So you're not focusing on one particular part of the scene. You're focusing on somewhere in the middle between the near and the far. This is called the hyperfocal distance. And then you're extending your zone of sharp focus using depth of field, stopping down to a small aperture. So a good rule of thumb when you're doing landscape photos is to estimate the distance from your lens to the closest object in your composition and focus on a point that's twice as far away from that, and then stop down to a small aperture like f11 or f16 to make sure you have depth of field covering near to far. So this works really great with wide angle compositions. Let's say I've got a clump of flowers in my foreground that's 4 feet away from my lens. I will focus on a point that's roughly 8 feet away, and then I will stop down to f11 or f16 from there to make sure that the flowers, everything else, and then the mountains in the background or whatever background scenery I have, make sure that's all in focus. But generally, if you are finding that when you're shooting manually you're out of focus, you're probably just not focusing right on your subject. So if you try to eyeball it through the viewfinder, you might not always be getting it right. I'll often use live view and I'll zoom into 100% to focus on the subject that I want in focus. And that's the best way to ensure that you have good focus if you're shooting manually. If you're not getting good results shooting manually, if maybe your eyesight's not as good, I know, for example, that I should be wearing reading glasses, but I refuse to admit that my eyes and my body is failing me, so I don't get them. So I'm often squinting when I'm trying to manually focus because I can't see very well. In those situations, autofocus might not be a bad idea.
All right. I've got a challenge for myself in this next question. It comes from a guest.
Okay. Hello, guest.
Any tips for creating a good B-O-K-E-H? Is that?
Bokeh.
Bokeh. I should have just went for it. Bokeh background with a sharply focused foreground.
Okay, yes. So bokeh is a Japanese word that refers to the quality of out of focus areas. So we've kind of changed the meaning here in the US, and we use bokeh to refer to a really nicely blurred background. So when people talk about a good bokeh, they're talking about having that really pleasing background. And this is something that usually if you're shooting like portraits or wildlife, You want to have your subject sharply focused, and then you want to have that background really super out of focus. So it's just this artistic blur of color. Because if it's slightly in focus, it's going to be distracting. And so the best way to achieve this quality bokeh effect is, first of all, to use a long lens, a telephoto lens. The longer the lens, the easier it is to get this out of focus effect, because these long lenses have much narrower depth of field than wider angle lenses. And also, you want to make sure that you maximize the distance from your subject to the background and minimize the distance from the lens to your subject. So if you're really close to a subject, let's say you're photographing with a 500 millimeter lens, and you're photographing your dog, and your dog is 20 feet away from you, and then the background behind the dog is several hundred feet away from you, that background's going to go nicely out of focus. The closer you get to the dog, the more that background's going to get out of focus. Or the farther you move the dog away from the background, the more that it's going to get out of focus. Now, if you're trying to get good bokeh with a wide-angle lens, it's a lot more difficult, because wide-angle lenses kind of inherently have more depth of field from near to far than telephoto lenses. And so getting a quality out-of-focus blur is usually only possible shooting wide open. Oh, sorry, that's the other thing before I get into the wide-angle thing. You get more blur when you shoot wide open. You want to use a very big aperture. So the biggest aperture your lens has is going to minimize the depth of field, and that's going to maximize how blurred your background looks. So if you've got a lens like a 500 millimeter lens that's an f4 lens, shoot at f4. You start stopping down to a smaller aperture like f11, you're going to bring more and more of that background into some semblance of being in focus. Now with a wide angle lens, as I said, it's very difficult to get that pleasing bokeh effect. Usually the only way you can do it, you got to shoot wide open with a lens like that. And even wide open, a lot of the background might look, it's not going to look completely in focus if you're focused on something that's close to you, but it's going to look enough in focus that it'll be distracting. Usually the only way you could really throw that background out of focus is to get super, super close to your subject that you're focusing on, like a foot away, and then, and only then, will you get that background to sufficiently blur. But even then, it's not going to look as good as the bokeh effect you're going to get with a telephoto lens.
All right, and now I know how to say bokeh.
Bokeh. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right. It might be Boke or Baka or Chewbacca, who knows?
But we've got it. We're gonna move past. This is where Shane had his great question about the bear.
The bear. Yeah.
And then we'll move to Isaac's question.
Hello, Isaac.
Ian, when shooting wildlife, do you spend a lot of time researching and learning about the animals you are capturing beforehand?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to prepare for a shoot. So trying to understand your subject, whether it's a landscape subject or a wildlife subject, the understanding of each subject is different depending on what you're shooting, but trying to get an understanding of your subject is usually a pretty good idea. So the more you know about its activities and mannerisms is going to be helpful. So for example, if you're going to be photographing lions in Africa, it's helpful to know that they're most active around sunrise, sunset, twilight, and that during the middle of the day they're usually sleeping. So you don't want to waste a lot of time trying to photograph sleeping lions. You're going to be out there when they're most active. So these are definitely helpful things. But I'm not always a super planner. I'm more of a reactor. I will go and I'll react to conditions. So I like to kind of do my study when I'm there on the ground, and I just observe my subject and try to get into the rhythms of my subject. Everything you photograph has got its own natural rhythm, and learning those rhythms. With landscapes, learning the local weather patterns and learning the way the light looks at sunrise and sunset, and learning that often at night in the particular location you're in, it gets cool at night and fog forms in the morning. Learning these little patterns, these rhythms are really helpful when you're trying to make great photos. And with wildlife, it's the same sort of thing. You learn their patterns, their rhythms. You learn the way that the cheetah pack will hunt across the plains. And it's really helpful in figuring out where to be, and also for you to catalog the kinds of mannerisms that you want to document when you're taking photos. So definitely doing some research ahead of time is good, but even if you don't get a chance to research that much, or you don't do much research, really being patient and observing your subject when you're there on the ground in the field making photos goes a long way.
All right, we have another question coming in from a guest.
Hello, guest.
You had mentioned one of the specific lenses that you used for the shots that you shared with us, but this was just a general question. What lens are you shooting these with? So if there were any additional lenses you wanted to point out.
Yeah, I've got a wide range of lenses in my kit. I shoot Canon cameras, and so I've got a mix of Canon and Tamron lenses. So I mentioned the Tamron 15-30. Which is a really nice wide-angle lens. I also use my Canon 11-24. I've got a few other Tamron lenses, the 24-70, the 35-150, the 150-600. So Tamron gives me a lot of lenses, and so I end up using them quite a bit. And what I use depends on what I'm shooting. So if I'm shooting landscapes, it's almost always just my wide-angle lenses. When I'm shooting wildlife, I'll be using the longer lenses. And sometimes there will be some meeting in between for both of those types of shots. Sometimes I'll use longer short telephoto lenses, for example, with landscape. Sometimes I'll be using wide-angle lenses when I'm shooting wildlife. But yeah, I've got a constantly changing mix of lenses in my camera bag. Lenses go in and lenses go out. So some break, some I just don't like and I sell them. Some just sit on my shelf and never get used. Some get used all the time.
The breaking comment leads very nicely into our next question from Christoph, who wants to know, did you destroy another drone on this trip, or was this one spared from your constant carnage?
No, I have not destroyed a drone in about 1 year. As a matter of fact, the only thing that's happened to me in the past year is the drone has destroyed me. The drone destroyed my face when I was in Greenland. And on this particular trip, I only flew my drone one morning when I was out in South Dakota. I didn't bring the drone up to the Canadian Rockies because it's mostly national land up there and drones are prohibited. So my drone has been sitting safe in my house. And at first it was relaxing because it was out of danger. It was like, well, finally that Ian Plant guy isn't like flying me into a volcano or something like that. But I sensed after day 2 or 3 it was starting to get bored. And by the time I got home, it had wrecked all of my furniture. Yeah.
It happens sometimes.
Spun itself up and just tore the furniture apart. So you got to be careful with these drones. They're very temperamental. Yes, I need a drone sitter.
Hannah's got a next question here. I find it difficult to have the illusion of depth when photographing overlooks. So do you have any tips?
Well, yes. If you want that illusion of depth, you do need that foreground. You need something or you need to create a visual progression. Sometimes I'll be on an overlook and I'm not just photographing the background scenery. Maybe you might be looking at a progression of mountains that recede into the distance. So having a bunch of different shapes going from bottom to top in your composition, these successive ridge lines can help create the illusion of depth. So you need some sort of visual progression. If you're just zooming in on the background and shooting nothing but the background, you've got one major visual element in your photograph, you will not have an illusion of depth. You need something in between you and your subject to create that visual progression that's going to give your photograph the illusion of depth. So trying to find a way to incorporate some of the stuff that may be where you're standing as part of that composition is going to help a lot.
All right. We have a guest coming in with a question about a drone again.
Hello, guest.
Do you ever use drones for wildlife photography?
I've never used the drone for wildlife photography so far. Since I've had the drone, I have been photographing wildlife mostly in places where you're not allowed to fly the drone. And I'm a little nervous about using it for most wildlife photography because I get the feeling that the drone is going to completely wig out most animal subjects. I think that it's a sound that they're not used to, and it's coming from a place that they're not used to having sounds come from. I have seen some pretty interesting wildlife shots taken with drones. A lot of them, I can tell, the animal looks like it's freaking out, which is not good. If I can figure out a place where I can use the drone creatively to photograph wildlife, and I'm not going to freak the wildlife out, and it's legally allowed to do so, I would happily use the drone in those situations. Actually, what I want to do is there's been this one bird that whenever I go out to my car, it's pooped on my car. And it's been messing with me for quite some time now. So I'm going to find that bird and I'm going to fly my drone at it just to freak it out. Just get revenge on that guy.
Just that one wildlife animal.
Yeah, but he's a jerk, okay? Actually, if I fly the drone at him, he'll probably end up just getting scared and pooping on my car. So I'm kidding. None of this is true.
Well, we're nearing into our last little chunk of questions. We have a little more than 5 minutes left,
Okay.
so we're going to try to get through as many of these as possible.
Rapid fire, go.
Yes, that's right. We'll move into another question from a guest. Any advice for high contrast shooting situations like Utah's Canyonlands or Arches National Park?
Well, 2 bits of advice. One, you can wait until the contrast is diminished, like shoot at sunrise, sunset, or twilight when the range of shadow and light gets a lot less. The second bit of advice is learn how to do exposure blending, which is actually pretty easy in things like Adobe Lightroom, where you can just take multiple exposures of the same subject and then merge them to HDR. And that allows you to blend those 3 exposures and balance your exposures. And you're not going to have highlights that are too bright or shadows that are too dark. So what you do in the field is you take a bracket of 3 photos, one that captures the detail in the bright areas, one that captures the detail in the shadow areas, and maybe one in the middle, and then you blend those 2 or 3 exposures together using Adobe Lightroom's Merge to HDR feature. Pretty simple, actually.
All right.
Next
question from another guest.
Hello, guest.
How much of the work do you do in camera versus post-processing?
I am more of a photography traditionalist, so I am working very hard to make sure that what I capture when I'm in the field looks really good, which means a lot of time I'm waiting for that perfect sunrise or sunset that doesn't happen, and so I'm often going back to the same places. I'm not doing a lot of heavy manipulation. There are some folks out there, especially landscape photographers, who are doing things like changing the skies. You know, they'll add a rainbow that wasn't really there. They're doing a lot of extreme manipulation. I'm not doing any of that. My workflow, when I do present it to people, people tend to be a little surprised. I remember once showing my workflow, and at the end, some guy said, "That's it? That's all you're doing?" It's pretty basic. You know, I'm really just trying to optimize the image file, the raw file that I've captured, to make it look presentable and to subtly tweak it to bring out its best. I'm not a real big fan of aggressive manipulation.
All right.
So I think we have time for one more.
We might be able to sneak in 2.
Go,
Let's see. Lisa's got the first one.
Oh,
Ian,
Lisa.
you travel all over the world. Do you ever photograph in your own backyard, so to speak?
Yes, I do. As a matter of fact, I published an ebook on street photography, which was mostly shot here in Minneapolis, which is now my own backyard. And I do a lot of photography in some areas that are not too far away from my home in Minneapolis. I love going up to Lake Superior, which is a few hours away, and I love going out to the Badlands, which are also only a few hours away, so I consider them to be in my broader backyard.
Right in the Midwest.
Yes.
Mary has a question.
Hello, Mary.
Do you like using metal prints? What do you prefer? Canvas, paper?
My favorite prints are metal. I've tried all other different kind of prints, and everyone's got their own particular unique taste, but I love metal prints. These are prints that are printed on a sheet of aluminum that's coated, and they're very vibrant, they're very colorful, they're ready to hang, so you don't have to frame them, you don't have to put glass in front of them, which is the best thing. And I think they look better in terms of color than just about any other type of print I've ever seen. So I love metal prints, big fan.
Okay, we got an either-or question here.
Okay.
Linda K asks,
Hello, Linda K.
do you generally make your wide-angle images with one shot or a focus stack?
Well, so I do a lot of focus stacking. It's something that I have embraced relatively recently in the past year or two. I used to never focus stack. So I do focus stack just because you can ultimately get a sharper image focus stacking than if you try to use hyperfocal distance and depth of field. So, you know, I take the time. Some images don't need a stack, but I usually stack them anyways, even if they don't really need them, just to make sure I've got that edge-to-edge, corner-to-corner sharpness, and I'm maximizing my image quality by stacking instead of stopping down.
All right, let's finish with one last one.
One last question.
From a guest.
This better be the best question.
Ooh, let's see. What accessories do you find to be important for your outdoor photography?
Okay, so need a tripod, 1. Need a electronic shutter release, 2, very useful to prevent vibrations. An L bracket so that I can very easily switch between vertical and horizontal orientation when I'm taking shots without having to flop a ball head over. I find that to be absolutely critical. And that's pretty much all I need. As a matter of fact, a lot of times I go out without the shutter release. I just use the 2-second timer on my camera so that I could press the button and then the vibrations die down. So really, give me an L bracket, give me a tripod, and give me a camera with a wide-angle lens, and I'm as happy as a clam.
All right. Well,
Are clams happy? That's a weird expression.
we're making an assumption on that, I
They look
believe.
like they're smiling, but I don't think they're happy at all. I think they hate their lives. So I'm as happy as a pig. No, I'm not going to say that one. That's got a dirty word. I'm just happy.
Very happy.
I'm happy as a pig in mud. That's the PC version of it. Very happy. So I think that's it.
That's all that we have time for today. So a quick reminder before we let you go, follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and Twitter. Remember about that wildlife photography contest that you can participate in. Prizes include that Fujifilm X-T30 camera, Skylum Luminar 3 and 4 bundle, and the $250 gift card from mpb.com. So put your submissions in, vote on your favorites, and as always, we are sponsored by Tamron. So if there's anything else, Ian, why don't you sign us off?
Well, I'm Ian Plant, and thank you for joining us on this exciting episode of OPG Live. We'll see you again next month. Bye.